The tolling of the bell can only mean that the time has come to experience terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, and when the bell chimes midnight, I will transform into Danielle. Welcome to the show, everyone. It's so good to have you here. We're going to be discussing the 1991 Dark Shadows revival series, a much-awaited episode, and of course, appropriately enough, it's episode 91 of Terror at Collinwood. I was waiting for episode 91 to do this one. Gotten a lot of requests for this episode, and my guests, Dominique, Lamssies, and Stephen Stark, did an incredible job of covering the series with me, so I look forward to presenting that to you in just a little bit. Before we get to that, I want to tell you again what a great time I had at the Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend. I had so much fun, and I recently had the great pleasure of visiting with Kristen Pierce and Cara Tillitz on Between the Shadows, a Dark Shadows podcast, and we were joined by Alan Gallant and Patrick McRae, and we broke down Dark Shadows Remembrance, and we had a great time chatting about it, talking about our weekend and what we liked best about it and the good times that we had. So check it out. Talked a lot about that. One thing I do wish I had mentioned, and I completely forgot to mention, Kristen asked, some favorite moments, and one thing that I really was so happy to get the opportunity to do was to actually sit down and hang out with Kathy Resch in person. Of course, Kathy Resch published The World of Dark Shadows, legendary Dark Shadows fanzine, the flagship Dark Shadows fanzine, and of course the Dark Shadows Concordances, fan novels, so much she published and did for the Dark Shadows fan community, including being one of the key founders of the Dark Shadows festivals and going back to ShadowCons. I had Kathy on the podcast back in episode 19 of Terror at Collinwood, and I ran into her near the cafe at the hotel, and I went up to her and said, "You're like my hero." So we sat down for a while, and then Janet Meehan joined us too, which was really cool. Brilliant, longtime Dark Shadows artist who created many beautiful illustrations and spoke at the Lara Parker Celebration of Life. So it was really cool to get to meet her in person too and hang out with the two of them. What a pleasure that was, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to do that. One other person that I met at the Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend was, I believe her name was Maria Schmidt. She runs the Mysterious Adventures tours, and next year, on June 25th through the 30th in 2025, she's going to be leading a Dark Shadows tour. It's Reigniting the Legacy of Dark Shadows, a 6-day supernatural journey through New England. And you can find out more at mysteriousAdventurestours.com. Celebrating the 59th anniversary of Dark Shadows, join our 6-day New England trail tour that follows the mysteries of Dark Shadows. Imagine reliving the stories found in these iconic towns where filming took place, or where their landscapes inspired this classical Gothic horror series and films. So the tour is going to go from Bucksport, Maine to Camden, Maine, Rockport, Maine, Newport, Rhode Island, Cary Seaview Mansion, the Black Pearl, Essex, Connecticut, the Griswold Inn, Norwalk, Connecticut, Tarrytown, New York, the Lyndhurst Mansion, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and much more. And I'll put a link in the show notes. It's mysteriousAdventurestours.com/dark-shadows-2025. And it looks really interesting. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this, but I just want to get the word out about it because it sounds cool. I have never joined a Mysterious Adventures tour. I don't know what they're like, but their website looks pretty snazzy. So check it out. Sounds like a really cool time. I like that they're going up to Maine because, Dark Shadows is set in Maine, and to my knowledge, this is the first time where they're going to places that were close to where Collinsport should be in terms of like Dark Shadows themed events. But yeah, that's kind of a fun thing. So, you get kind of a general vibe of Collinsport, and then suddenly a portal opened. And I heard the dogs barking. Might be my dog Crispy, though. Barnabas is coming. We gotta get to the show. Let's do it. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now There are spoilers ahead. Welcome to both of you. Returning to the podcast today is Dominique Lamssies, who you heard back in episode 7, where we talked about the 1795 storyline. It's been a while, Dominique. It's been a couple of years since we did that, but I'm happy to have you back. Dominique is a writer and blogger at the University of the Bazaar. She's been a guest on podcasts such as Monster Kid Radio, the Classic Horrors Club podcast, and 1951 Down Place. And you can sometimes find her at conventions unleashing her creations of terror. And Stephen Stark, a new visitor here to the podcast, is a fan of all things Gothic and has an online Substack where he writes about music, film, society, mental health, or whatever he wants. One thing he wrote was a piece dedicated to his love for the 1991 Dark Shadows revival series, which is the much requested topic of tonight's episode. Welcome, both of you, to the show. It's great having you here.
Thank you. Really excited to be here. This is a topic that that really deserves a lot of attention and is sometimes, I think, a little bit overlooked. So I think this is awesome. This is a great opportunity to maybe even introduce some people to this incarnation of Dark Shadows that might not even be aware of it, actually, just because it was so short-lived, unfortunately. Very bittersweet, but because it was cut short, but amazing that it did happen, and it is, captured on, best of all, on VHS.
Yes.
Also DVD and streaming, but that's another story. Yeah, VHS is definitely, if you can get your hands on it, the way to experience this series.
Yes, and Dominique, it's been a hot minute since we've talked, subsequently quite a bit.
Yeah, of course.
Social media, but it's been a while since you've been on the podcast. How have you been?
Yeah, pretty good. Things are trucking along.
Nice.
Always with the new monsters and all that fun stuff.
Now, are you still doing the House of the Silent Graves Etsy store is no longer exists, but you're still creating your mad creations, right?
Correct. We have temporarily moved to Facebook. I'm in the process of doing a new website, like an entire new website.
Nice.
So if you ever need a Tangler or any other monster, let me know. Look me up.
Nice.
I got you covered.
Awesome. You will have those at your table whenever you do conventions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, as I mentioned, this topic, the 1991 Dark Shadows revival series, has been requested ever since I started the podcast. People have asked, "Are you going to talk about the 1991 series?" And of course, I've brought it up quite a bit in conversations about talking about the original series. But certainly the 1991 Dark Shadows. For sure deserves its own episode, or possibly series of episodes. I might circle back to it again. And Dominique and I have talked for a while about doing a 1991 episode. Dominique expressed interest, and Stephen had written an article for his Substack, which he emailed to me, and it was a really great article about his love for the 1991 series. So I want to ask, Dominique talked about how she discovered Dark Shadows. I want to ask you, Stephen, just real quick, like, how did you discover Dark Shadows? And 1991 series was your introduction to Dark Shadows, right?
Yes. So it started off with a photograph of Ben Cross as Barnabas Collins on our sort of like generic local TV guide that came with the newspaper. And I was just very intrigued. It was a classic portrait of Barnabas, Ben Cross as Barnabas, with the wolf's head cane. And I was just I would have been 9 years old at the time, and I was just really fascinated by this photo. And I remember my mother said, that used to be a show whenever I was young. And I was like, oh, interesting. She said, yeah, they're doing like a mini series or something. She's like, I'll make sure to tape it for you. And she did. And I was hooked right from the get-go. I had no exposure to the original series. But I do remember around that time, while the 91 series was airing, TBS was also airing House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows. So I did get a little bit of a taste of the original series. And, as soon as I found out that Dark Shadows, the 1991 version, would not be back. It was wonderful to at least have the original series to dive into and see all the just wonderful and magnificent places that series went. It was, in my mind, almost a continuation of the of the 91 thing, because I was looking for more. And certainly found that I just wrapped up last summer, finally getting through every episode of the original series.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, it all started off with that photograph, and that was, I didn't know anything else. So for me, that I think it speaks to the fact that the real spirit of Dark Shadows really did come through in the 91 series. Obviously very different. It wasn't a soap opera. It was prime time. It had bigger budget, had the luxury of multiple takes and so forth. So it didn't have the liveness and a lot of the feeling of theater that came along with the original. But it also shows that Dark Shadows is, literary canon. So even in that new incarnation, I think the spirit of it was there. And it comes down to great stories and great mood and great music, because Robert Covert was involved in the 91 series as well. And even at 9 years old, his score for that just really, really haunted me. In the best possible way. And for me, the music's on the level of, like Twin Peaks or something like that. Just beautiful.
Yeah. And Dominique, I remember when you were on the podcast, you talked a little bit about how you got into Dark Shadows, but could you just kind of recap a little bit, particularly with regard to the 91 series?
Sure. So I actually, I have a piece in Our Shadowed Past too that actually talks about this.
Yes. Yeah.
But I honestly, because I was thinking about this, I don't quite remember how it happened. My best friend at the time, Katrina, her mom was one of the ran home from school crowd. So I'm guessing that she got excited about it and Katrina got excited about it because we were both the weird little goth girls. And then she got me excited about it. And then I just kind of remember watching it. And that was it.
Yeah. You got hooked after that.
I got hooked. And yeah.
Just for some background, Dan Curtis, after Dark Shadows ended, he, of course, we know he did a lot of great TV horror films and even theatrical films like Burn Offerings and stuff. And then he wanted to kind of move away from that. Subsequently, of course, did Winds of War and War and Remembrance. And through all of that time, people were constantly trying to get him to do Dark Shadows again. It was a regular thing that he would field requests to do Dark Shadows again. And he didn't want to do it for a long time, because he had this thing, where he wanted to do something else. He didn't want on his gravestone the creator of Dark Shadows. He wanted something else in addition to that, so once he got Winds of War and War and Remembrance under his belt, I think he felt better about going back to Dark Shadows. And it was Brendan Tartikoff at NBC who was instrumental in making that happen. Brandon Tartikoff really wanted to do Dark Shadows. He wanted Dan Curtis to do it, and he convinced him. They shot it in 1990, and I remember this was such a huge, because I had been a fan of the original show for quite a while at that point. I adored Dark Shadows. So when a new Dark Shadows was announced, I don't know if it was Shadowgram or one of those, one of those, it was probably Shadowgram or World of Dark Shadows. I think it was Shadowgram. And it was huge. I mean, the fandom was just on fire with excitement for this new Dark Shadows that was coming. I remember even an early version of the logo that they revealed that was a totally different logo from they decided to go with the more like the original style logo, which I'm happy they did. The other one was kind of funky looking.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was just kind of one in the zines and stuff. But I remember those TV magazines when those came out on the Sunday TV listings, when they would have those in the newspaper, and I collected I went all over. I went to like all the like neighboring towns and stuff. I was just going around everywhere to get to collect those. And I was so excited. Barbara Steele was going to be in it. My goodness. And I know you have a great Barbara Steele story, Dominique. I'd love to
Oh, wow.
you would share it in a
Yeah,
bit.
quote unquote great, embarrassing but great.
No, it's so cool though. And Ben Cross was going to be Barnabas. Ben Cross from Chariots of Fire. They were bringing back, like you said, Steve, like Robert Cobert was doing the music.
Yeah.
Dan Curtis was helming it. Sam Hall was involved. He wrote,
Oh, yeah.
writing the pilot. You had people who were creators on the original Dark Shadows involved in this. And I remember my birthday is on January 12th, so the show premiered on January 13th. So I felt like
Wow.
it's like
Oh,
the
nice.
greatest birthday present ever is a new Dark Shadows. And I thought it was really cool. I loved it at the time, I know there are a lot of fans that have mixed feelings about it, but I think generally speaking, it's well liked. Generally speaking, I think by the fan base, because even though it was basically a remake of the original and House of Dark Shadows, a lot of the storylines and stuff, it was true to the spirit of the original Dark Shadows, I thought, in that
Yeah.
it was a gothic
Absolutely.
tale, it was very cool in that way.
Yeah.
So what is, I guess, general, before we dive into sort of the actors and the stories and stuff, like what are kind of some general thoughts on the series?
In one of the interviews in the Coffin box set,
Mhm.
Dan Curtis talks about how he wanted to make this the version that Dark Shadows fans thought they had. Because he says he talked to some fans and
Yeah.
what he remembers making was different from what they remember seeing, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's very much more lush, it's very much more decadent, it's much more showy, and they definitely had more money.
Yeah,
You
for
can tell
sure.
that 100%. I also feel like because Steve's talked a lot about the music, and I think that's actually kind of an important point because the theme, the way they redid the theme, it's very subtle, but it goes from being like straight spooky, like the original theme was, to being spooky but mostly heavy. The
Mhm.
orchestral undertones they added in, it adds sort of that dramatic heaviness
Mm.
to it, which I think fits this version of the show better.
Uh, General thoughts. I mean, I think it's one of the greatest pieces of television ever made. Now, I have a unique viewpoint because this is how I came into it. And the original Dark Shadows is just so unique for so many different reasons that it's such an unfair comparison, really. It's it really is like a different medium for Dark Shadows because soap opera is so much more different than like a primetime show. Just such a different way to approach story and in particular pacing. And so, things like that. The original Dark Shadows just it had so much more because it was a soap opera, almost like room to kind of breathe and
Mhm.
to stretch things out. This was obviously much more condensed and each episode packed a lot more. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's completely fair to compare them, but it is still Dark Shadows. So people are obviously going to have their preferences. I think that it's very tragic that the show was cut
Yeah.
so short because I think that the production values were on point, the music was on point. There were so many great actors, so many great performances, and they did recycle a lot of story from the original. I think that a second, third, maybe fourth season they could have really branched out and brought in some new some brand new storylines, but
Yeah.
it just packed a lot of punch. And I think Ben Cross was absolutely fantastic and was very respectful in his portrayal of Barnabas Collins because he didn't try to take any of the mannerisms or even like the hairstyle of Jonathan Frid and really breathed new life into it. I think was the Barnabas character was there, the essence of it, but it wasn't trying to redo Jonathan Frid.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. He was still recognizably Barnabas Collins. The
Right.
essence, like you said, the essence of Barnabas was there, but it was
Hmm.
a very different take on the character. And yet it was still Barnabas. Although I
Yes.
would like to see somebody Photoshop the bangs on Ben Cross. Nobody, I don't think anybody's ever done that. I want to see what that would look like.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Somebody who has Photoshop skills listening to this, please do that. So you touched on some of the cast here, so I want to talk about that, but I also want to
Yeah.
address what you were saying about the cancellation of the show.
Mm.
It came on as a mid-season replacement. They aired that 2-hour pilot, and then the very next night they aired 2 and 3 back to back the next night. But
Okay.
then episode 4 got preempted. The Gulf War hit, and
Yep.
that
That's it.
was a huge
Yeah.
monkey wrench in the works. That threw off the schedule. People's minds were on serious matters here with the Gulf War.
Yeah.
Also, in the interim, Brandon Tartikoff had left NBC and was replaced by Warren Littlefield.
Mm.
And Warren Littlefield just didn't get it. He is the one responsible for canceling Dark Shadows, and later regretted doing it.
Mm.
Um, it and I remember the protests after the show was canceled. I mean, there's 12 episodes, and it didn't really get a chance to, like you mentioned, Stephen, going off into its own territory and doing new
Right.
new things, and it didn't really get the chance to do that. And I think it would have. I know some of the things they would have brought into. They definitely were going to do Quentin for sure,
Mhm.
but they could have taken those ideas and tried new things. I mean, eventually, I mean, they were blowing through the storyline. I mean, by the time it ended, we had just come back from 1795,
Right.
so eventually they would have surely started doing their own thing. It didn't get a chance to develop its own identity. I think it started to
Right.
a lot towards the end, and
Mhm.
it was a shame that it didn't really get that opportunity. And I remember the protests. I went to, it was so stupid. They had one in my hometown of New Bedford, Massachusetts, in front of City Hall. I'm like, why is NBC going to care about a protest in City Hall in New Bedford, Massachusetts? I remember the news even came and everything. And I remember I had a sign with like the eyes of, tried to draw them like Ben Cross's like contacts with
Yeah.
the red kind of yellow eyes, and it said Barnabas commands you not to cancel Dark Shadow.
Amazing.
So
Well,
stupid.
I will say that 9-year-old me I was one of the fans that wrote a letter to NBC,
Hmm.
and I really thought it was going to make all the difference.
Yeah, a lot of
I
people
really
wrote
did.
letters. A lot of
Yeah.
people did.
It was devastating whenever I found out because it just seemed like, I mean, it was such a cliffhanger, especially for a fan that didn't know didn't see the original and had no idea of what might happen next. It was
Mhm.
just mind blowing that that was it. That was
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, that was the worst cliffhanger if you don't know, if you hadn't seen the original and you didn't
Right.
know what was coming. This is the worst cliffhanger.
it,
Yeah.
yep, it really is. And
But it had that classic Dark Shadows, that dun dun dun,
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. There would have been, it did, yeah. And it would have been interesting because that presented an opportunity to go in a different direction. Because
Yeah.
Vicky finds out Barnabas is a vampire in the past, and now she's in the present. And how are they going to handle that? Now, the writers were torn about what they were going to do had they continued. Some of the writers wanted to bring back Julia's medallion and have her erase Vicky's memory like she did with Maggie Evans. But Matt Hall, the son of Grayson and Sam Hall, who was also a writer he finally got to be part of the Dark Shadows family, so to speak. He was the son of two people who were very prominent in Dark Shadows, and he got to be a writer on Dark Shadows. He wanted Vicky to not get the memory erased. He didn't think it would work. He said in the series in the 60s it worked. Not He didn't think it would work in the 90s, and his feeling was that maybe Vicky would try to help Julia try to cure Barnabas, to try to find a way to help Barnabas, that she would be somewhat sympathetic. um but that some of the writers felt she wouldn't be sympathetic because he murdered, Daphne and all these other characters. So who knows? They never got there. A really interesting book. There are two really interesting books here. This one's by Jim Pearson. It was released by Catherine Lee Scott for the video version. This is Dark Shadows Resurrected, and it was released by Pomegranate Press. And there's also the Dark Shadows 1991 Concordance, which was a fan publication by the legendary Kathy Resch, who used to do the World of Dark Shadows fanzine, and loaded with lots of great information. Both of these books, or if you're a fan of the 1991 series, both books are highly recommended. So let's talk about the cast. I'm going to read some of the cast here. I'm going to try to get through all of them, actually. Ben Cross as Barnabas, Joanna Going as Victoria, and Josette Dupre, Gene Simmons as Elizabeth Collins Starter, Naomi Collins, Roy Thinnes as Roger and Reverend Trask, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as David and Daniel, Barbara Steele as Dr. Julia Hoffman and Countess Natalie Dupre, Stefan Gerach, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, as Professor Michael Woodard and Joshua, Lizette Anthony as Angelique, Jim Fife as Willie and Ben, Juliana McCarthy as Mrs. Sarah Johnson, and Abigail Collins, Michael Kavanagh as Sheriff Patterson and Andre Dupre, Michael T. Weiss as Joe Haskell and Peter Bradford, Eli Pouget, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, as Maggie Evans, Veronica Lauren as Sarah Collins, Barbara Blackburn as Carolyn Stoddard, and Cousin Millicent, Adrian Paul as Jeremiah, Rebecca Stab as Daphne, Eddie Jones as Sam Evans and the bailiff, Henry Evans, Steve Fletcher as Deputy Jonathan Harker, love it, Wayne Tippett as Dr. Hiram Fisher, and Ellen Wheeler as Mistress Phyllis Wick. So, I mean, the cast for this thing, you honestly, like at that time in 1991, I don't think you could have picked a better cast for this. It was there were a couple of things. Okay, I have a couple of gripes with a couple of things, but generally speaking, I think it's a very good cast. I don't know. What do you think, Dominique?
Okay. Part of my opinion of this is colored by the fact that this is my baseline for Dark Shadows. This was my first experience. So for me, pretty much everybody across the board was just like that's who should be in that role. That's where it started. That's what it was. I actually think it speaks very, very highly of the material itself that Dan Curtis actually got Barbara Steele to come back to the horror genre to play this. Because at this point, like shortly before this, she was in her, if I have to crawl out of another coffin, I'm going to murder somebody phase.
Yeah.
So it says something about the source material that he actually got her to come back and do this.
Yeah. And I mean, what a great choice to play Dr. Julia Hoffman. I remember reading when she was going to play Julia. I said, oh my God, Barbara Steele, you're right. She had not done, she had kind of walked away from the horror genre. She was working behind the scenes, and she worked with Dan Curtis actually on Winds of War and War and Remembrance.
Yes.
I think she was the producer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so they had known each other behind the scenes. So, Dan Curtis talked her into doing it, and she was nervous about coming back to do this. And but it was great that she did. And can you tell that story about Barbara Steele, Dominique?
Okay, so I have to preface this story by saying that I discovered Dark Shadows when I was 11. Basically, in like when I was 11, I discovered everything that would make me the person I am today. All the music, all the books, all the TV, all the movies, that just all hit when I was 11. Which means I started being a horror fan then. And when you're 11 years old, you're an 11-year-old girl, and you're watching these horror movies, and the girls are running around in their underwear, getting axe murdered and screaming and breaking a heel. It takes a toll.
I get
it colors your perception of things.
Yeah.
So when I sat down to watch Dark Shadows, and it's one of the moments that always sticks in my head is not Victoria on the train. It is Julia Hoffman, Barbara Steele, walking off that train, and her self-assurance and everything that came after.
Yeah.
Because I'm sorry, Danielle, I'm going to swear, but I mean, Julia Hoffman is a stone cold badass. as Grayson Hall, as Barbara Steele. She is a stone cold badass, and she's supposed to be. And so to actually see a woman in a horror role that was self-assured, that was strong, that was not going to get pushed around, that was in control, that you needed to listen to, that was a big deal, especially when you're 11.
Yeah.
So to, I think it was 2018. She was a special surprise guest at the Lovecraft Film Festival, and they showed Black Sunday, and there was a Q&A afterwards. It was actually hosted by Derek Cook of Monster Kid Radio, and so I bugged him and he asked about Dark Shadows. So we got her to talk about Dark Shadows a little bit. And then she did a meet and greet afterwards, and I walked up to her and I started to explain, because I'm tearing up just talking about it now. I started to explain what she meant to me as Julia Hoffman, and just like then, I completely choked up like this and just stared at her and started bawling and literally ran away.
Did you come back?
No.
Oh.
My friend who I was with like grabbed the picture that I had signed and was like, she's emotional, you understand, I'm sorry about that. And Barbara was very nice about it. She's like, that's very sweet, tell her thank you. And but yeah, so nice. I cried and ran away from Barbara Steele.
Oh, that's, I mean, she's a legend. I mean, it's so, and yeah, she's just, I always imagined like what it would have been like if they had convinced one of the horror stars to appear in Dark Shadows in some role, and it happened. It was Barbara Steele. So, and then later exactly. Christopher Lee too, although we won't talk about that version of Dark Shadows. But
good.
Yeah. I don't know what you're talking about, Danielle.
Moving on to so okay, so I thought the cast was very well cast. Some of the other standout actors, we mentioned Ben Cross. His portrayal of Barnabas was different, not as like Jonathan Frid could be terrifying as Barnabas, but he was also very sad. Like there was a sadness to him, and Ben Cross did that, but he was also extremely feral, like you know, with the snarling and the hissing and all of this. So it was a different personification of that character. Still recognizably Barnabas, but different. Although I could have done without. This is not a performance thing; it's a costume thing. The turtlenecks. I was not a fan. Not a fan of the turtlenecks. No,
that is peak '90s fashion. Though.
I know.
Yes, it is very '90s, and I remember wearing. I think I was inspired to wear black turtlenecks around that time from Ben Cross.
Really?
Yeah.
See, to me, Barnabas wears a suit and tie. I liked it when Ben Cross was wearing the suit and ties in those.
Well, episodes. You know what? It's almost like the 1991 version of like the Afghans in the original. Then maybe it's sort of like that.
However, Barnabas did still wear the overly fancy, unnecessary smoking jacket dressing gowns in this version too.
This is true. So that kind of balanced out the turtleneck.
They were nice.
Situation.
They were very nice.
Gene Simmons. Who are you going to cast as Elizabeth Collins Stoddard? Joan Bennett was so regal. She was a movie star from the golden age of Hollywood.
Yeah.
She was classy, and so was Gene Simmons. I mean, and Dan Curtis would cast people. He said, I cast on the nose instead of casting against type. He cast on. I think the spirit of that character was there in terms of Gene Simmons' portrayal.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on her?
I liked her quite a bit. I think the problem with the problem wasn't with her performance. It was with how they didn't use Elizabeth in the show. Because I feel had she been written the same way that Joan Bennett was, I feel that there would have been almost like no difference.
Yeah. You know, Steve mentioned the serialized format of the original show allowed some room to explore. And this felt like it was like Dark Shadows Greatest Hits, but kind of blowing through a lot of the nuances. And I can see the problem there too. Like it would have been cool to see the Jason McGuire blackmail thing happening with Elizabeth. Everybody kind of had their own thing going on in the original show. And Liz, most of those characters, they touch on something that's going on with them, like Roger with his room of locked paintings and then painting of Laura, you know, but we only get to really see that in one episode, and we never got back to it. And I'm sure if the show had imagine if they had gone like several seasons, they would have been able to explore all of these characters more deeply than they did. thoughts on Elizabeth or any of the other characters, Steve?
I thought Gene Simmons was great. Yeah, of course, I would have loved more of her and more of so many other characters and storylines too.
Mhm.
But I think where Gene Simmons really stood out for me was as Naomi.
Oh, yes. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Really nice sympathetic performance and some really nice moments between her and Ben Cross.
Mhm.
And actually, I'm thinking of early on in present day Collinwood. There was, the costume ball, and there's a scene with Barnabas outside, sort of, sad, and
Yeah.
um, and uh, and she's out there with him. And I don't remember exactly what happens in the scene, but I remember it's for me, it's a standout. It was just a really nice scene between them. Yeah. So actually, Ben Cross and Gene Simmons for me had great chemistry actually.
Mhm.
But I really thought that one of the biggest standout performances for me is Roy Thinnis as Trask.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh
Just
my God, I love him as Trask.
larger than life,
That was insane.
um,
Yeah.
just an unbelievably great performance. And that he brought in some of the camp from the original, I thought, with his portrayal of Trask, which is a great character to do it with. But he sort of had that over the top thing going on in such a beautiful way. And I'll never forget him being, walled up by Barnabas and his screams. And
Mhm.
it was just, Roy Thinnis was fantastic. And he played a really interesting Roger too, a much darker version of Roger Collins, I thought.
See, I think so too. Because like in my opinion, Louis Edmonds Roger is great, but he's just a butthead. He's just a jerk.
Yeah.
Where the Roy Thinnis version, you feel like he's damaged.
Mhm.
He's been
Yes.
through some stuff. He's seen some stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's he's scarier too.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I love.
Absolutely.
I don't know if there's anybody in the 91 series that I love more than the original cast. There are a couple that are maybe tied, but
Right.
I don't the original series. I wouldn't even say I wouldn't say the original Trask was camp so much as he was very theatrical and fanatical with
Yeah.
Jerry
Yeah.
Lacey's portrayal, that insane fanatic. But this
Yeah.
took it to another level where he was just some creature out of a fairy tale or something. He was just really this disturbing, monstrous character.
Yeah.
And his Roger was definitely more human. I love Louis Edmonds. He was just because he was such a pompous,
Yeah.
but yet
Mhm.
charming to watch. You
Yeah.
can't take your eyes away from. He's just fun to watch.
Mhm.
But this is he had an aristocratic air about him, whereas
Yeah.
this is a much more down to earth Roger, I think, in terms of
Mhm.
his performance. Of course, Roy Thinnis was from The Invaders. I mean, it was just such a
Mhm.
great like going back to
Mm.
Gene Simmons. I mean, she was Oscar nominated for Hamlet. Her kids
Yeah.
were Dark Shadows fans. Roy Thinnis, of course, The Invaders, one of the greatest science fiction shows of all time. Um, it was a very different version of Roger.
Mhm.
It was a different take on the character, but still very believable. And I
Yeah.
think damaged is a very good word to describe him. You can tell that he's been through some bad stuff, and that whole thing with Laura and the room
Right.
and what happened there. Really interesting stuff. Then we have young Joseph Gordon-Levitt as
Mm.
David, Barbara Blackburn as Carolyn. Any thoughts on them?
Well, I thought her portrayal of Carolyn was fantastic. Um, there's there's something really interesting going on. I think, especially I think it's the pilot episode where I don't know, she plays a much more sort of sensual version of Caroline. I'm not sure if there's some sort of homoeroticism going on there, but I've heard other people hint at it. Just kind of the way that she interacts with Vicky in those early episodes. It's I don't know. It seems to be implied. It's just a much more sexy, sensual version of that character, in my opinion.
For me, Carolyn actually ended up being the opposite of Roger. Because I feel like in the original series, she's just kind of like the sheltered, naive little girl whose mommy has just been protecting her and hasn't let her grow up. And in the new version, she's Roger. She's just kind of nasty and mean for the sake of being that. And this is the one character where I didn't like her before I watched the original. I just don't like the character. I've known women like that. I don't want to deal with you. That said, it is a very good portrayal. I feel like she was a great actress. And oh my God, when she was playing Millicent, woo! I love Millicent.
Yeah.
Millicent was amazing.
She was great. And I will say Joanna Going, for me personally, was the best portrayal of Victoria Winters for me. That was the best actress to play that character.
Yeah, Joanna Going. Yeah, it's your favorite version, Dominique?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can one woman be that pretty? She's literally ethereal.
She is beautiful.
Pretty.
Yeah.
Oh man. 9-year-old me
then they
was
put her in the Josette makeup. Yeah. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, it was definitely, hey, for 9-year-old Steve Stark, this was a huge awakening. I'll say that.
She was also a good actress. She is also a good actress.
Yeah.
She's one that I would say is for me is tied because I like Alexandra Moltke a lot too, but she's very almost like a royalty, which she literally is, the actress Alexandra Moltke.
Yeah, that's right.
So she kind of gives off that air that she's related to Joan Bennett. Like you can almost kind of get that vibe. And I liked Vicky, especially in the pre-Barnabas episodes in particular. She had a little bit more curiosity in figuring things out. But I liked Joanna Going a lot. She's really was quite good, I thought. And I mentioned Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who went on to be a movie star. I mean, he came out of. Does anybody ever ask him about Dark Shadows? I wonder. Like, I've never seen him in interviews. Like, I would love if somebody would ask him, some of his thoughts on doing that.
It probably doesn't register to anybody that he was in it.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah,
he was 11.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean,
he was good. He was really good. I mean, he definitely played a very troubled child. It was, for me, it was very believable.
Yeah. One I'm going to bring up is a prominent character in this show. I liked his acting. I think he's funny as Jim Fife, but for Willie, I had some issues with his Willie just because I felt like he was kind of out of place almost because it was like I was watching Don Knotts play Willie Loomis sometimes. And I think he's funny and he has great comic timing and he's lovable. It was just a very different take on Willie. I mean, the original Willie could be funny too and stuff, but there was something sad and disturbing too about the original Willie and it was pre Barnabas Thrall. He was really horrible, but I didn't get the Willie vibe from Jim Fife, but I thought he was a good actor.
Yeah, it was almost a little too silly. The original portrayal, that Willie character was able to evolve. Barnabas was really able to kind of change him, and his character was just evolved. I don't know if it would have been as believable to see Jim Fife's character evolve so much.
I'm gonna go to bat for this one because I actually kind of prefer this Willie. Now I'm gonna qualify that by saying, in my opinion, this is my hill, I'm planting this flag. John Carlin was the best actor in the entirety of the original series. He was the best actor. But for me, I don't know, because all the plot lines with Willie amount to a person, like it's a grand karma thing, so that he was nasty to people, so everybody just keeps being nasty to him, and it just gets piled on and piled on and piled on, and it gets increasingly hard to watch. And for me, this version, he's just kind of a screw up. And he's probably done some bad stuff that we haven't explored yet. But he's earnest and he means well. For me, that just I find that a little more agreeable, Because there's
Yeah.
actually a couple characters in the original run of the series that, I mean, I do not like. Do
Mhm.
not like. And I don't like watching those plot lines again when I rewatch it and stuff like that. So to have because there's a couple characters in this version that were softened a little more in ways that I find they're more appealing for me.
Okay. Like I said, I mean, he was certainly, I think I'm kind of the outlier. And when I'm saying that is was kind of a little too comedic for me because I think most people, and I liked him, don't get me wrong. It's just,
Yeah.
I thought it was a little too funny sometimes or goofy a little sometimes with the nut loaf and all that kind of stuff. But moving on here, I'm going to talk a little bit too about some of the other actors that we see that are not as prominent, but are you know, performers, regulars in the series. Michael T. Weiss as Joe Haskell. We had Eli Pouget as Maggie Evans, very different take on Maggie Evans. And of course, in the 1790s storyline, we had Adrian Paul as Jeremiah. It was great seeing him in that role. And then he, of course, went on to great fame in Highlander as well. So it's quite a few. They brought I mean, they threw everybody in there. It looked like. I want to talk a little bit about those characters. Sam Evans. We had Sam Evans. We had Sheriff Patterson. I thought he went a little heavy with the Maine accent. Where did it go? Where's all the blood? Yeah.
I remember watching it the first time and being all like, why is he talking like that? Because I didn't
Same.
know about the main accent. I'm just like, why is he talking like that?
Yeah, I didn't get it either.
Nobody else in Collinsport has the main accent.
Yeah.
And it was heavy Maine accent. I'll have to ask Alan Gallant if that's Sheriff Patterson's doing an accurate Maine accent in that episode. Thoughts on some of these other characters that I brought up, or any other characters that I didn't bring up?
Well, I think Maggie Evans, the Maggie Evans character was very different, and I really thought that character could have been really explored in a second season. Her tie to the, I guess, supernatural, like with the tarot cards and so forth, was really interesting. I would have loved to have seen that explored more. And I thought Lizette Anthony did a great job as Angelique.
I was going to get to her. Yeah.
She's I mean, just so fiery, and man, Ben Cross stepping into Jonathan Fridge's shoes, very difficult, and same thing with Laura Parker. But for me, Angelique was maybe the most interesting character for me. Whenever I was watching it for the first time, I just thought that she was just amazing. And I don't know, I remember one scene in particular where she's sort of casting a spell on it's the duel between Jeremiah and Barnabas, and she's casting that spell, and I just remember that being just fantastic. She did a fantastic job.
She's on the roof of
that
Collinwood or the old house. Yeah.
The random gargoyle that we have no idea where it could possibly be.
Yes.
That's what it was, gargoyle. And she was amazing. But you know what? But also the character Angelique is amazing. What an amazing character to play. Might be my favorite character in Dark Shadows. And the tension between her and Ben Cross it was fire.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Dominique, thoughts on Lizette Anthony's Angelique?
Again, this is my baseline. I absolutely worship that woman. She's probably somebody else I would cry in front of if I ever met her. I think, and she's not French either, I don't think. So the fact that she got that accent was like, amazing.
I think she's British. If she's British,
yeah,
I think, and she was beautiful. I mean, Laura Parker is lightning in a bottle. You can't replicate that, but she didn't try to.
Right.
And I like Ben Cross, like Steve said about Ben Cross. I love her. And Angelique is my favorite character. Always has been, always will be. After we would watch the show, me and my friend Katrina, we would always play Dark Shadows. She was always Josette. I was always Angelique. That tells you everything you need to know about both of us right there.
That's cool.
I love it. I thought she was great. I really liked Lizette Anthony as Angelique. like with Barnabas, I would have liked to have seen, I think if the show had progressed, I would, because in the original series, you get to see a lot of different aspects of Angelique, that she's kind of,
Mhm.
I guess, more multi-dimensional in terms of like, they have a similar motivation, but you see sort of Angelique she's conflicted sometimes about things like Barnabas too, but
Right.
because they're speeding through storylines, you don't get as much of that. And I would have liked to, I think she's a great actress. I think she would
Yeah.
have been able to do that if the show had progressed and we had gone on more. It would have been interesting to see how her character would have developed. Um, I mean, Angelique in the original series was also like a vengeance machine, but I would have liked to,
Mhm.
but there were other elements to the character that I think
Yeah.
were
Yeah,
not
she was
explored.
vulnerable. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
there were
Mhm.
definitely signs of vulnerability with her, and yeah, yeah, it's just one of so many things. It's like, oh man, what if,
yeah. It's
and
like, and
Yeah.
which
and
the
with
comic books got to explore a little bit.
yes, yeah, we got there was a lot of merchandise, or not a lot, I shouldn't say a lot. There was merchandise for the
Yep.
1991 series. The comic book by Innovation was gorgeous. It was a painted artwork for the comic books, and they went into territory that the show didn't. They even had Lara Parker as a character in well, not Lara Parker, but
Yeah.
her likeness as a
Right.
character in one of the storylines. And that's one thing they didn't get to in the TV show, which I wish they had, was they were plans to bring some of the original cast members
Mhm.
into the show. Several of them were interested in doing the show. And it just never happened. Unfortunately, and it would have been cool to have seen some of them show up, which I'm sure would have happened had the show continued. Dan Curtis was
Mhm.
still, in touch with many of them, and I'm sure he would have wanted to bring them in for different roles. Unfortunately, that was not meant to be. But Innovation did that great comic series. There were other cool things. They did posters too, a couple of big painted posters. I got those. I got the
Yeah.
comics. I still have the comics. Remember
Yeah.
Aberlayer released a couple of watches. There was a Barnabas
Yeah.
and an Angelique watch, and
Mhm.
the box for the Angelique one played music. I don't remember if the
Huh.
Barnabas one played. It was like a little coffin for the Barnabas one, a cardboard coffin, and then there was like a cushioned sort of box for the Angelique watch, and you open it, and it was a music box. I think it might have played Josette's theme. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember. I had both of them, and there was a
Which is
T-shirt.
kind
There
of
was
insulting if you think about it.
I know totally right. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a model of Barnabas, I believe.
There was, yes, in the
Yeah.
1790 outfit. Yeah, I had
Yeah.
that too. I was never good at building
Yeah.
models. But I had that,
Yeah.
and that was a t-shirt with Barnabas on it.
Mhm.
So they had a few products that they released for the 90s series. Adrian Paul, he was Jeremiah. This was a change from the original series. When they go to 1790, Jeremiah is Barnabas's brother instead of his uncle. What do you think of that change in the story?
I'm 100% for it because,
Mhm.
frankly, in the original, it made no sense that
Yeah,
Jeremiah was the uncle.
I
okay.
would agree.
I think it worked. It also makes it a little more personal. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still messed up if your uncle runs away with your
Mhm.
fiance, but it's it's his brother, so that kind of almost um made it even worse almost.
Yeah.
I liked
And
Adrian
that
Paul.
was some good chemistry too between Ben Cross and Adrian Paul. They
Agree.
were
Yeah.
brothers. I 100% bought that. They must have been friends before they started filming the show.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
It
Yeah,
just seemed like they knew each other so well.
I think they got along very well on the set. I thought Adrian Paul was a great Jeremiah. He's one that I really liked a lot in that role, at least for the short time that he was there. But he's the one they had pegged for Quentin. Had
Yeah.
they brought back for the next season.
That would have been perfect.
Yeah, he
That would have
was.
been perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, he was going to be Quentin, and I think that would have been great. I agree. To this day, David Selby is still the only actor who has ever played Quentin in all the versions of Dark Shadows we've seen. We have only ever had one actor
That's
play
so
Quentin.
interesting.
Yeah.
Or well, I guess would you technically say that Thayer David did at one point?
Oh, good point. Good
That's
point.
true.
Yes,
That's true.
you are
Mhm.
correct. Correct. You are right. Bayer David played Quentin. You are right.
Technically.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read through quick. I'm not going to read everything here, but I'm just going to kind of hit on some of the major stuff. So the pilot for the show was a couple hours long. It was a TV movie, and it starts with Willie, he's convinced that an old Collins family legend is true, that family treasure is in the mausoleum dating back some 200 years. Obsessed with finding these riches, Willie enters a secret room in the mausoleum, opens a chained coffin where he believes the treasure is, releases vampire Barnabas Collins. Meanwhile, newly hired governess Victoria Winters gets acquainted with the Collins family, in particular, David Collins, the troubled boy she'll be tutoring. David claims to know a girl named Sarah, who is only visible to him upon being released from his 200-year slumber. Barnabas now introduces himself as a distant relative from England and begins to romance the beautiful new governess, who bears a remarkable resemblance to his fiancée, Josette Dupre. In the meantime, the town of Collinsport is being terrorized by deadly attacks, the victims losing several pints of blood by way of a strange bite, neither animal nor human. Following the fatal attack by Barnabas, now that was episode 1. Episode 2, following the fatal attack by Barnabas, Daphne Collins rises as a vampire. Dr. Julia Hoffman, a blood specialist, discovers Barnabas' secret and offers to help, hoping to cure Barnabas of his vampirism through a series of experiments. Episode 3, Julia begins her experiments to help cure Barnabas of his vampirism. Hoping to soon be human again, Barnabas intensifies his relationship with Victoria. Barnabas' future is threatened by the investigations of Professor Michael Woodard. Episode 4, the mysterious child ghost of Sarah Collins appears to Victoria and leads her to a library in Collinwood's closed wing and gives her an old diary. Barnabas and Willie are stunned when the evil apparition of the witch Angelique Bouchard materializes from the fire in the fireplace. Episode 5, I'm only going to read half of these and then we'll do the other half. Victoria is overwhelmed when Barnabas gives her Josette's 18th century music box. Learning of Barnabas' growing affection for Victoria, a jealous Julia decides she will not yet fully cure Barnabas of his vampirism. Barnabas ages to his true age and attacks Carolyn Stoddard at the Collinwood costume party. Barnabas warns Julia that he will have his revenge on her. This is episode 6, when a seance is held to contact Sarah Collins' spirit. Victoria vanishes and a strange woman appears in her place. So that's the first half of the series. Sorry, I printed this off from the Dark Shadows fandom wiki, which is a very good resource, but my paper was cut off. So I was trying to fill in the blanks there when I was reading that. So the first half of this series basically covers the introduction of Barnabas' storyline in the original series. It's a very condensed version of that. And it also, especially the pilot is basically a remake of House of Dark Shadows in many respects, not completely, but it's some of it, even sometimes it's even shot for shot for House of Dark Shadows. And then later with Daphne instead of Carolyn getting turned into a vampire, it's this cousin Daphne, who's a new character, Collins family member. She's the one who gets turned into a vampire. There are a lot of House of Dark Shadows in here, and there's introduction of Barnabas. The big difference is, I always said, House of Dark Shadows is what would have happened if Sarah Collins didn't exist. If this is like a parallel time where Sarah Collins was never born or never came back as a ghost. Here we have Sarah. It's like they're doing kind of House of Dark Shadows, introduction to Barnabas storyline, but they're infusing Sarah into the mix too, which was an important factor, I think, in Barnabas's arc in the original show. And she plays a role here as well. So I guess any thoughts on this first half of the series where we're doing the cure for Barnabas, any of that?
I felt like it took a little while for the series to really pick up speed after. Well, it didn't take a while. I just think that the pilot, I don't know, it's just a slightly different tone for me. It doesn't quite match everything else that came after that. Not that that's completely bad thing, but you can feel like it just didn't really hit its stride maybe until right after the pilot, which I think is pretty typical of any pilot, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I almost feel like, especially because it was Dark Shadows, like you're making the pilot and you're like, okay, this is the thing we have to do. Mm-hmm. We have to bring Barnabas out of the coffin. Mm-hmm. And then episode 2, all right, let's have some fun. Let's do what we want.
Yeah, I feel that way too. Yeah, well put.
I also think I'm going to take a step back, because I think Maggie in this version of Maggie while sort of the trappings are different, I actually think this is factory settings pre-Barnabas sassy Maggie.
Oh,
In
yes, good
spirit,
point.
this is the same character.
Good point.
Because she was the way she would talk to people, and it reminded me of original OG Maggie
Yes.
before Barnabas came.
I think you're right. OG Maggie for sure. It is that's the more sassy Maggie Evans. Although this version, like you said, the trappings are different because they made her a psychic in this version, and she's has knowledge about the occult and stuff. She's also, one thing I didn't like, not a big fan of the whole relationship with Roger. And I guess it's because my mind flashed to the original series. I don't know why. I was just like, no, I'm not. No. Opinions may vary on that one.
Got their thing. Everybody's got their thing.
Yeah, I wasn't feeling the whole Roger and Maggie thing.
Where were they going with that? That's what I want to know. Where were they going with that?
I don't know.
I think that she was. I saw Maggie was going to help, sort of maybe channel Laura from the flames or something like that. I don't know.
The other thing, I'm glad you brought up Laura, because the painting we see is Lizette Anthony. It looks like Lizette Anthony, and Lizette Anthony was supposedly going to play Laura. And there was another debate as to how that was going to work. Was she going to actually be like basically Laura merged with Cassandra, like it was Angelique all along? But that wouldn't have made sense because we saw her as a floating spirit quite a few times. So was she like astrally projecting? Like how would it have been the Laura, the Phoenix Laura? They called her a witch in the show. So I don't think they solidified what they were going to do with Laura. They were definitely going to bring Angelique back in the present day, and the painting looked like Lizette Anthony. So it's unclear. Nobody really knows exactly how that was going to go down.
If you notice in the pilot, the portrait of Josette actually looks more like Ellie Pouget than it does.
Oh, interesting.
If
I
you
did
look
not
closely,
pick up on that.
it looks more like Maggie than it does Vicky.
Interesting.
It still kind of looks like Vicky, but it looks more like Maggie.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. That was another big change they made from the original series, where Vicky is the lookalike. So interesting that that doesn't surprise. I'll have to go back and look at that, but that doesn't surprise me because I'm sure Dan Carter was like, well, that's what we did the first time, so that's what we're gonna do this time. But maybe they just decided it would make more sense for Vicky to be the lookalike. In the original show, it just kind of happened organically. Like it was just, Maggie was a supporting character, and then all of a sudden she came into this prominent position in the storyline, and it was really a cool thing to do and unexpected too, since Vicky was the protagonist of the series. What did you both think of that decision? I mean, I guess this is like your baseline, like Dominique was saying. So for you, this is probably, was it surprising to go back to the original series and discover that that's not what happened in the original series?
I was definitely surprised. Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, I didn't understand it. Like because I knew he ended up going after Vicky anyway. So I'm like, yeah. But again, the soap opera versus the primetime thing. Because there's a lot of things, especially when you get into 1795, that they streamlined that I feel benefited the story as a whole.
Joe Escobar, who's a Dark Shadows fan, he's been on the podcast a couple of times, he suggested, since they were pulling a lot of themes from Dracula, his thought was that originally the Maggie was going to be sort of the Lucy character, and that Vicky was going to end up being the Mina character in those roles. But Barnabas became a huge smash hit as a character, so they were like, well, we got to keep Barnabas around, and they decided not to go that route with Maggie. So I don't know if that's the case, but it makes sense. Anyway, so the whole present day storyline, Julia's trying to cure Barnabas. I love some of the things they did that were interesting effects wise too. I mean, this is obviously something they could never have done in the original series, but the whole thing with Julia taking the baseline sample of Barnabas's blood and putting it in the sunlight, and it just starts bubbling, and then the vial just bursts. It explodes, and she goes to look, and it's just powder. The blood turns to powder. It just like these cool little touches that they added that were fun and crazy, and I dug that. Joe Haskell, Michael T. Weiss, was Joe Haskell. We see him; he plays Peter Bradford in the past, so he plays again. We had no Nathan Forbes this time. It was
which is a massive downvote for this series, by the way.
You think they should have had a Nathan Forbes?
We need Nathan Forbes in every Dark Shadows series ever. Nathan Forbes and Aristide.
Yes. Don't forget Gerard too.
Oh yeah.
The episode I'm going to post tomorrow is an interview I did with James and Valerie Storm, so that'll be out by the time this one airs.
Yes.
Yeah, it was really cool talking to them. A couple of things too we didn't mention. The location for the show was the Greystone Mansion. They used Greystone for Collinwood and for the old house. They used a different shot of it for the old house. They subsequently also used it for the unaired WB pilot or Dark Shadows that also served as Collinwood. I thought Greystone looked cool. That model that they used, the opening credits were cool with the rain pouring down and the lightning and with the music playing, and that model where it's panning around. I really dug that.
Yeah.
I do wish with Greystone, like Seaview Terrace and Lyndhurst too. You see them and you're like, Collinwood. To me, it's like you see the tower. I think the tower kind of I wish there was some element to that mansion that screamed Collinwood in that way, where it's like, okay, this is an iconic sort of visual, where it's very striking and you can see, and it's a beautiful mansion. I'm not knocking the mansion, obviously, but I just wish from a visual perspective that it had that some more character, I guess, in that regard.
I can, I hadn't thought of it, but now that you mention it, yeah, there is something missing to make it extra distinct. I do see that. It doesn't feel maybe gothic enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
that's it.
Yeah. And it just, that's one thing with maybe shooting on the West Coast too. That was sometimes like, I wish they would, I don't know. I kind of wish they had taken the crew back out this way to and have the Atlantic Ocean, and some of the visual elements looked too California to me, I guess.
Yeah.
But maybe that's because I grew up on the East Coast and in New England, so that just kind of jumps out at me. I would imagine maybe it wouldn't jump out as much maybe to others. I don't know.
No, I'm from Oregon. It looked California to me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It just, there's something very distinctive. I mean, that's not a knock on the show. It's just like, that's where they were shooting it. So
part of it is the sunshine, the amount of sunshine. Like, California, not New England.
Yeah. And Barnabas shouldn't have a tan. Barnabas.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there was, and that was really exacerbated by the DVD release, which Steve mentioned, because they really screwed up that DVD release. I wish the VHS tapes, the MPI put such TLC into these VHS tapes. That's why I kept them, because it's like extended version of the pilot, extended version of the final episode. They even released a separate documentary about the 91 series. They put a lot of, I don't know, just effort into the VHS releases, whereas the DVD was like kind of a cash grab because the Tim Burton Johnny Depp movie was coming out, so they were like, well, we're gonna put this out, and I'm glad it exists on DVD, but they screwed up the aspect ratio, so the image was cropped, and they screwed up the day for night, because they used day for night on the show, which Curtis loved to do day for night, but when they transferred it, I guess they used the wrong transfer, and they didn't have the day for night filters in that version that they transferred over or something, because that was done in post, and it looks like Barnabas is walking around, in the daytime, and there are these brightly lit scenes on the DVD release, and I think it's like that on streaming too, isn't it? I'm not entirely
It is.
sure.
Yes, it is.
It?
Yeah, same thing. And like for a vampire show, this is really crucial.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, and I think it is streaming on like Hulu, right? Is it Hulu or I know it's on YouTube.
YouTube, and I think it is now on Hulu. I might be on Tubi as well. I think
it's not on Tubi.
I think.
No.
Okay.
It's not on Tubi.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe Roku channel. Yeah, that might be it.
I know it was on I I know it was on Hulu. Sci-Fi Channel aired it back in the day. They would play it periodically. I think it was on Chiller, the Chiller channel too, right? Yeah, I think it was.
Huh.
So all right, I'm gonna just read through the rest of these. Are pretty short, the rest of these synopses. Episode 7, the Collins family fears for Victoria, knowing that she has been transported to the year 1790 in the 18th century. A bewildered Victoria meets the Collinses, who resemble those she knows in 1991. A young and human Barnabas befriends her. Episode 8, Victoria remains trapped in the past. A jealous Angelique schemes to prevent the marriage of Josette and Barnabas using witchcraft. A deadly duel soon follows between Barnabas and his brother Jeremiah Collins. In 1991, the Collins family learns the identity of the strange woman from 1790, Phyllis Wick. Episode 9, in 1790, a grieving Josette bitterly accuses Barnabas of killing her only true love. At Jeremiah's funeral, the fanatical Reverend Trask has Victoria arrested for witchcraft. A deadly attack soon follows when Angelique practices sorcery. Episode 10, in 1790, the Collins family mourns the apparent death of Barnabas as they move into the new Collinwood mansion. Rising as a vampire, Barnabas attacks Josette. In 1991, Joe Haskell witnesses Barnabas attacking Carolyn in the cemetery. Episode 11, in 1790, Victoria's witchcraft trial begins. The evil spirit of Angelique attempts to prevent Barnabas from making Josette his vampire bride. In 1991, Julia becomes possessed by Angelique. And episode 12, the final episode of the series, Barnabas's vampirism is discovered by those in the past. Joshua Collins and lawyer Peter Bradford desperately try to prevent Victoria from being hung as a witch. Back in 1991, Victoria's return from the past is jeopardized as Angelique, possessing Maggie Evans, plots a murder. Yeah, that's all it says in the summary there. Obviously, I skipped through a lot of things. Joe Haskell is killed by possessed Julia. Julia's possessed by Angelique. She kills Joe Haskell. Vicky discovers that in the past that Barnabas is a vampire. So when she wakes up, when they switch, she switches places with Phyllis Wick. She looks at Barnabas, and there's that great cliffhanger we mentioned with dun dun dun. And Barnabas is wide-eyed looking at her, and she knows she has a look of terror on her face as she looks at Barnabas. And that was it. Now, the 1790 part of the series, that's probably my favorite part of. I think this is where this show starts to find its own identity. I mean, it's still retelling the 1795 storyline, but it has, I don't know. I think it just gets a little tighter. The writing gets a little tighter.
Yeah.
And just the actors seem to have discovered their characters. They're just kind of settling into their characters. Stefan Gerach did a great job as Joshua Collins. It was a fun, different take on Joshua. I mean, it was an interesting character because in the present he played Dr. Michael Woodard, which was kind of Professor Stokes-ish, but it was supposed to be Dr. Woodard. I think they did that because to leave it open for Professor Stokes to come into the show. I assume they probably would have brought him in at some point. In fact, I think I had heard that they wanted Humphrey Allen Estrado to play Professor Stokes, as I recall. There was some talk about that, and that didn't happen. I think it was Professor Stokes that they were talking about for him. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. Okay, thoughts on the whole 1790 flashback.
So this is where I became the person I am today. This is like the 1790 flashbacks. This is the blood in my veins. This is where I fell in love. This is everything. The costumes are better. Like I still like rewatching it to do this. I just die when I see some of those costumes. I want them so bad. One thing I really liked about 1790 was the humor. The humor was like so well used. I love that scene where Millicent first arrives and all the guys are there to meet her, and she gets off the coach and she points at Ben Loomis and she's like, that man who calls himself a coachman, and he says, I never called myself a coachman. I love the way the humor is done. One thing we didn't quite get into was Mrs. Johnson.
Oh, she was great. Yeah.
Because I actually liked it because they softened her up a bit in present time, which made the transformation into Abigail much nastier.
Yes.
She was so good at Abigail. She was insidious as Abigail.
Agree. Yeah.
She was great. Her and Trask together were an amazing team.
Yeah. Agree.
Yes.
for sure.
And again, with Joshua, the Louis Edmonds thing, where the Louis Edmonds Joshua was again just kind of a butthead, whereas this Joshua, he was just damaged. He didn't know. I could tell he loved his family. He just didn't know how to portray it. Whereas Louis Edmonds Joshua was just kind of a butthead.
He didn't know how to express his feelings. He was so stoic, and he was a jerk. He was a bully, but he still had love in his heart, somewhere in there he cared about his family. But yeah, I agree. This Joshua was definitely more, it was a different take. He was more damaged. I agree. But I did like the humor for me in this worked well in the 1790. I agree with you. In that respect, it reminded me like 1897 and the original series had humor in it, but it was sort of this witty humor. It wasn't like wacky comedy. It worked in that Gothic setting, and it was balanced like in the 1790 by the tragedy, because in the original show 1790 there's no humor in 1795. It's one tragedy after another, relentless tragedy. The tragedy is there, but there is some balance with some levity as well. Stephen, what did you think of 1790?
For me, it was just so haunting, and I think they did a really good job of showing like the bewilderment that Vicky had, sort of just appearing in this new time.
Yeah.
And there's almost like I don't know, I think they did a really good job with that. I think that the themes in terms of the music were some of them just really heartbreaking, really, really beautiful themes going on there. And this is where the music just for me, went way more emotional than it maybe ever did in the original series. And just the music was a little bit heavier, more dramatic, obviously.
Like the scene where Sarah dies. Oh my God, the music in that scene just curb stomps your heart.
Yeah.
That music, and like whenever Barnabas is being chained and almost kind of like, Ben is is saying goodbye, like that music was just beautifully heartbreaking, really beautiful.
Yeah, I like Jim Fife as Ben. Actually, he was.
Me too.
He was good.
He was great.
Yeah, but the music. Robert Colbert created some new music because he did use a lot of the familiar themes, especially in earlier episodes. You hear a lot of the familiar themes, and he continued to bring them in, but he created a lot of new themes as well, that were really emotional and fitting for the scene. They did release a soundtrack for the 91 series, which is well worth picking up. I think you can still get it on Amazon. I'm not sure what it's going for these days, but it's worth picking up. And Dominique, you mentioned the costumes. I loved the costumes too, and they were actually more authentic to the look of the 18th century. I mean, they took liberties obviously in both shows, but the costume budget, I think, was pretty high for the 91 series in comparison. I love the original series costumes too, don't get me wrong.
So do I,
but beautiful costumes. Okay, when we talk about Dark Shadows and a new Dark Shadows, and what's being floated now is a sequel series, which I'm excited about the idea of, because they have never done that before. Other than in the Big Finish audios, that's audio format, but they've never done a sequel show. Would you rather see another reboot though? Like, I mean, the 91 series was cool. There were things I would have done maybe a little differently. I mentioned the snarling with Barnabas earlier. I could have done with maybe a little less of the standing outside the window, because I love, Jonathan. With Jonathan Frid, it was like, he would just look out the window with a candle and you'd hear the dogs, and it was eerie. So I'm sure they were trying to go for a more, Dan Curtis was like, make him feral, and I get what they were going for.
Well, that's, if you rewatch the 1790 parts right after watching Dan Curtis's Dracula, and you will see exactly where all the shots, all the blocking, all of it came from, because that is exactly what he
Mm.
had Jack Palance doing. Jack Palance
Oh,
was
yes.
standing on the edge of a forest, snarling, staring in windows.
You're right. You're right. It's been a while since I've
Hmm.
watched that, but now that you mention it, yeah, it's absolutely true. And total sidetrack here, but I know you've done you did a podcast episode on, I think it was Monster Kid Radio, about Blackula.
Yes.
Which is, I love Blackula
Mhm.
and Scream, Blackula, Scream. There is a lot of Barnabas, I think, in Blackula.
Blackula is the most Dark Shadows thing that is not directly Dark Shadows.
Right, right.
The way
Yeah.
the character is constructed, the way the plot line is constructed, the feel of it. I mean, it's Dark Shadows. It's the Dark Shadows cousin.
I think the people that were making Blackula were Dark Shadows fans, watching Dark Shadows, and
Yeah.
they put that
I
in
would
there.
bet money. I would bet money they were.
Yeah. Yep. But just total sidetrack there on that. But so would you want to see another remade Dark Shadows, like a retelling of the Barnabas story in 1795 and going on into, Quentin and parallel time and all of that? Or would you rather see a sequel series?
Sequel series for sure. Time for something new. Yeah, absolutely. I want new stuff. I think, especially in the original, it's just amazing how many the scope of the Dark Shadows universe. It's hard for me to think of any other show that has such an expansive universe. I mean, and that universe that also just exists just within Collinwood. You could look at a show like Doctor Who and it's all over the universe, but the universe that exists within Dark Shadows, just within Collinwood, is so expansive. I mean, to me, it feels unrivaled. So, the original went in so many different directions. I would love to see that happen again. Just unexpected stuff and just take risks and just make it even more expansive. I would love to see that.
Dominique, what about you?
I'm actually going to give a twofold answer to that.
Okay.
Because actually, I'm going to give a threefold answer to that. First of all, I don't care. Just make more. Second of all,
yeah.
Second of all, I think a sequel would be a good idea, because like Steve said, the world is just so expansive. And because Danielle, you and I have talked about this before, where for it to be Dark Shadows, we need more stories in Collinsport, because Collinsport is Dark Shadows in the same way that Gotham is Batman.
Yeah.
But my counter proposal to that is also to do an expanded universe like anthology show, because I am absolutely obsessed with the history of Petofi, and we need like a season about what happens in the Forest of Ajdan, and like what was that story, The Curse of the Crimson Pearl, and that all happens in New York or something like that. And just these other stories that fed into the larger plot line but are still part of the world. I want to see those too.
I 100% agree. Yeah, I would love to see it. We definitely need the Count Petofi backstory in the Forest of Ajdan and the last unicorn, and 100% agree with that.
And then it's got to end with him getting Aristide out of jail, because it has to have Aristide in it.
It has to, exactly. But who would play Aristide? That is the question.
Ooh, oh man.
Oh man. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Again, big shoes to fill. Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Well, first of all, I mean, give me everybody who looks like Freddie Mercury. That's step number one. And then we'll go from there.
There we go. Then we can whittle it down.
Yeah.
A sequel series maybe, and then did flashbacks to things like Petofi's backstory, or Elizabeth and Roger in the 1920s when they were when they were growing up, and all of that. I mean, we never got to see any of that, and they reference certain things that would be interesting to see for sure, or way in the past too. Like they could do time travel to when Isaac Collins arrives in Collinsport, like some of that early stuff that we never saw. There are so many possibilities. Expansive universe is right, but I also love the idea. It's like a lot happens in Collinwood itself and in Collinsport itself. I think it was Wallace McBride in the Collinsport Historical Society said Dark Shadows is like Star Trek for introverts, because they go into parallel universes and go travel through time, but they never leave the house. They're just
wow, that is so perfect. That is spot on.
I was like, yep, that sounds about right. That's great. Closing thoughts on the 1991 series. It's something I do not want to, I don't want to see it fall through the cracks. And it is,
Mhm.
it's almost like, you know, it was a major thing at the time. We were so excited about it. And then it's kind of, people still know, fans still know about it. But I worry, you know, it's like, this is part of Dark Shadows history. It was the new Dark Shadows that they made in 1991. And I hope it doesn't get left by the wayside. I hope they do a proper Blu-ray release for the 91 series with the day for
Yes.
night and the
Mhm.
correct aspect ratio. So
Agreed. I think that the 1991 Dark Shadows it would make sense to put it on Blu-ray. I think it would be a noticeable upgrade to actually have it in high def. But I think that, you know, it's a masterpiece in mood. It's very true to the Dark Shadows feeling, and you know, not every incarnation of Dark Shadows has really carried the spirit of it, but this is part of the true Dark Shadows canon. Um, it's tragic, you know. It's like the Dark Shadows itself is tragic, and like the history of this revival, it is tragic as well. But it's just so wonderful that it happened. Those 12 episodes are just really delicious, and I agree that it needs to be treated the way that MPI treated it on the VHS release. And it would be great if it came to Netflix. I think that that a whole new generation would discover it, and would be uh, much more likely to come into it, as opposed to, you know, what is it, 1,200 and whatever episodes of the original. I think that this would just be a lot more palatable, still actually to a younger audience. And yeah, it deserves its place. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of television in the 90s. I think it stands up there with, you know, it's some of the contemporary shows like Twin Peaks and the X-Files. And it's really fun to dream about what could have been with this, but maybe that can serve as you know, stimulation, or some fodder for whoever takes on the next incarnation. And it feels like it's time. It's like way overdue for it to come back to television. And right now feels like the right time. It just feels right. And if you noticed, it's always come back during periods of great sort of turmoil, you know. Um, the original series, you know, obviously coincides with a lot of big historical things, Vietnam War, and then the
Yeah.
Gulf War, and then, you know, it just feels like we need it right now. We need that. We need that escape. We need that expansive Collinwood universe. It just feels like it's time. I think it's going to happen within a year or two. It just feels right.
Mhm. Okay. Dominique?
I mean, yeah, what Steve said. I think goth never dies.
Right.
There's always the undercurrent there, and I
Yeah.
feel like the wheel is starting to turn and it's starting to come back.
Yes.
Okay, the last voyage of the Demeter. Come on,
Mhm.
come on. They actually got that movie made. If that's not a signal that we can do Dark Shadows now, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that movie is like 100% old school period goth on a ship.
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
let's all volunteer right now, just for the record, to be consultants for the next English as well.
Yes.
Okay. They need to bring Wincliffe back, and then I'll be one of the inmates.
Oh my God,
Oh,
yes.
wow.
Oh, that's
Wow.
awesome.
Yes. Yes.
One thing,
That would be fantastic.
I'm gonna end this, but one thing I forgot to mention, Steve Shutt, who's been a guest on the podcast a few times, and he sent me a link to an interview with Matthew Hall, and he talked about working on the 91 Dark Shadows. It was difficult for Sam because, you know, Dan Curtis was, you know, playing tapes of Grayson talking in the next room. He could hear his mother talking basically, and
Mhm.
Sam could hear his wife talking. You know, she'd passed away. I think it was difficult, and there was some tension there. But one of the things that Matthew Hall mentioned was that he was pushing for Iman to be cast as Angelique. That's
Yes.
really interesting too, to think about, like,
Mm.
what would she have been like in that role too? I'm kind of interesting. I mean, I love Lizette Anthony. She was
Oh, yeah.
wonderful, but it's like, how would
Yeah.
Iman have done in that role?
I think it would have been very interesting, and if she could have brought David Bowie on board too, even
Oh my
better.
Right? Oh my
There's your
God.
Aristide. There you
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Or anybody. That would have been
Yeah.
amazing.
No,
Wow.
no. David Bowie needed to play Stokes.
Oh my
Mm,
God. Yeah. Oh, I could see that. Oh my God. The
for
sage
sure.
occult scholar, David Bowie. Oh, I can see it.
Yep, right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me to talk about the 1991 Dark Shadows, the long-awaited episode. It's Dominique and I think we've been talking about this for years now. And Steven, you sent me that great article you wrote, which I will put a link to in the show notes.
Great.
And I will also put a link to University at the Bazaar. And with that said, thank you again to both of you. And I hope that we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.